The most conservative estimate I've ever seen coming out of I think it was the CDC at one point, was 500,000 a year. 500,000 private gun ownership uses in order to prevent a crime. And then you will see the press come out and be like, oh, that's ridiculous. It's only like 127. And they're like, well, okay, wait, whoa. 500,000 over here, 127 over here. Like, how do you reconcile that? Well, because the press will say that, well, only 127 people were shot and killed by a private citizen using a firearm to defend themselves. Like, okay, what about the ones that were shot and weren't killed? Or here's an even better one. How about the far more common occurrence, which is bad guy comes in to break down the door to beat his ex-wife or his girlfriend, and she goes, "You sure about that?" And he leaves.
Right.
See, if you're not going to count that, if you're going to insist that the only stats that matter is when she actually has to pull the trigger, you're not being intellectually honest, and you're doing it on purpose. But here's the other crazy part about stats, and I brought this up before. If you look at the way the anti-gun crowd uses stats, let's use the domestic violence scenario. So guy comes over and he's drunk again, and he's there to beat up his girlfriend. Right. And he comes in and she has a firearm this time, and she shoots him and he dies. All right. That's one scenario. Scenario two is she can't get a firearm. She wasn't able to get her permit, or she lives in a place where they put a lot more restrictions and waiting periods. So he comes over and he beats her to death. The gun statistics look better for the left. The gun statistics look better for them if she dies getting beat to death than if he dies getting shot in self-defense. Think about that for a moment and then ask yourself, are they really trying to create a safer community, or are they really just selectively targeting a particular tool or instrument? Because that is unconscionable. The fact that you could stand up there with all this bravado that the Shannon Watts of the world does and say, look at all these gun statistics, and then you look a little bit closer and you're, well, wait a second. Are you honestly saying it would have been better for this woman to be beaten to death? Are you honestly saying it would have been better if that shop owner would have been shot? Are you honestly saying it would have been better simply because your gun stats would have improved? I want a genuinely safe community, not one that's been arbitrarily made to look so because of the manipulation of statistics.
And Nick, you raise a great point that, at the core of what you're saying, gun control actually makes women less safe. And, you look at the example of Carol Bound in New Jersey, who was very tragic. I mean, I can give you tons of examples of exactly what you're talking about, where women did protect themselves with a firearm against an abuser. But in this case, Carol Bound was dating a guy who was a pretty bad guy, and she finally broke it off. And I'm sure her family said, hallelujah. Well, he wasn't happy about that and was threatening her. And so she went to get a firearm because she wanted to protect herself. But unfortunately, in New Jersey, they have all these extra background checks and requirements. And so it's can be a several week process. And it certainly was for her. And so she's waiting week after week. I think it was even more than a month, still no word. And she wanted to be legal and buy the book, so she didn't go buy one on the street. Well, while she's still waiting for permission to be able to purchase a firearm, her ex-boyfriend, who was a felon, shows up in her driveway. And by the way, he didn't need a gun to assault her. He just had a knife, and he cut her up and knifed her to death. And it was just the most tragic thing, because here's a woman who could have protected herself. Again, so many examples of women who have done just that. Broken it off with a guy, and the guy still keeps coming around, and they're angry and they're throwing things around, and now they're threatening them and they want to hurt them, but they have a firearm and they're able to protect themselves. Not in Carol Bound's case. And thank you, by the way, for correcting the stats. The CDC stats, as they examined many different studies, it was 500,000 to 3 million cases of self-defense every year. I think I misspoke earlier. So it's a wide range, but many of those self-defense cases are exactly what you were laying out, Nick, that they didn't all result in person pulling the trigger and then dead bad guy. In many cases, it just simply involved brandishing the fire. In fact, about 90% of the time or more, simply brandishing the firearm is enough to dissuade the attack.
Well, and you think about it as well. This is, again, where the stats manipulation really comes into play. Think about it if they did actually get their way. So let's use the low number, 500,000. 500,000 times a year, a crime was prevented from taking place or maybe prevented from manifesting itself in the way that it would have because somebody had a firearm. You take the firearm away. Are the politicians who pass the laws, are they now responsible for, let's say, theoretically 500 additional victims?
They should be.
They should be, but will they ever be held to account based off of that criteria? Absolutely not, because the way that they're focused on looking on this is gun bad, take it away. It's never about understanding the comprehensive nature of the discussion that we're really engaging in, which is free people are allowed to defend themselves. If you take away their mechanism for defending themselves, if you as a politician take it away, then yes, you are responsible for what happens. You're not responsible. By the way, this is a very important point. And again, something I've tried to explain to my colleagues. You are not responsible for how somebody uses a freedom inappropriately, right? I don't have to bring the speed limits down to 5 miles per hour because some people crash, right? If somebody speeds, if somebody drives recklessly, I am not to blame because they had the freedom to drive recklessly, right? But if I take their car away from them and now they can't get to work and they lose their house, and there's a whole train of things, there's a whole series of consequences that take place as a result of the government actively going in and saying, you don't get this anymore because we've decided it's not safe for you.
Right.
And they never see their responsibility on that side of it. But in a free society, that is the first place you should start. The first place you should start is not, how do I correct all of the world's problems by restricting the freedoms of free people? That's not how you start. You start off with, how do I ensure that I'm not infringing on essential rights, on essential civil liberties? How am I ensuring that we're fostering the sort of society where people have the means and the capability to provide for themselves and, yes, defend themselves, because we know the state's not always going to be there?
So let me give you an example that makes the point to a T. How we don't restrict the freedoms of the law-abiding. You know, it's often said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. And that is true. However, that doesn't mean that when people are going to the theater that we gag them in order to prevent them from yelling fire, right? No, If somebody yells fire and there is no fire, the individual gets punished. And it should be. It's ironic because people who hate the Second Amendment always use that example and they don't realize the glaring error or contradiction that they're presenting, because really that's how we should treat the Second Amendment, is that you should be free, if you are a law-abiding person, free to exercise your rights without infringement. That's what the Second Amendment says. But if you abuse that right, then that's the job of government to punish those who do wrong. I mean, that's classic. How we protect liberty and freedoms is you punish the wrongdoer. You don't put straitjackets on all the law-abiding to make sure that they don't step out of line.
No, it's absolutely true. I had this conversation with another show called The Shepherdess, and that was one of the points we brought up, is that do we really want to live in a society where when a relatively small fraction of the population abuses their rights, the rights of everybody else are now forfeit? Because if you do, you don't live in a free society anymore. And think about that. You're also creating this perverse incentive process where if you want a right to go away, then all you have to do is convince somebody else to violate it. And now you have the legal justification to take it from everybody else. And it has reached a level of absurdity. And the part that I do find encouraging is I do think that more people are actually willing to step up now and say, no, you need to understand there are certain lines you're not allowed to cross. And if you do cross it, you will not be met with my gentle compliance. I don't want to fight, right? I don't want to rebel. I don't want to resist. I don't want to have to do any of those things. I just want to be free, right? But if you're going to insist that I can't be, well, then you force me to be able to defend my rights and to do so in a responsible way, right? And to do so in as far as it's within my power to do so in a peaceful way. That's what we want. But it is amazing how so many people on the left who apparently hate the concept of firearms in the hands of private citizens, certainly don't mind it in the hands of the very government that they're now going to use to confiscate or impose or to take away. And so it is hypocritical. I pointed out before, the left, the anti-gun group is not anti-gun. They're anti-you having guns. They have no problem with the state having guns. And I just want to point out, if we're gonna go ahead and like just make an empirical argument where we stack up statistics in order to determine who's the greater threat with a firearm, I can promise you this much: the government has a far worse track record over history than private citizens do with respect to the abuse of firearms for nefarious or malevolent purposes.